Hello and welcome to another video. This has been hell of a week and I'm tired and exhausted, but it has also been challenging in a positive sense because of how much was going on. I guess I can tell you more about it in the next channel update. This is just my disclaimer, because if I'm going to have some bloopers in this video, I'm sorry. But now you know why, right? This video is going to be the first video in the series Are You Afraid of the Dark? And this series intends to teach you how to get the most out of unscouted radar blips. So in some situations you have a radar but you don't have a scout, and maybe you're going to build a scout but maybe you can't afford it, maybe you don't have time for it or whatever, and then knowing how to interpret radar blips and guessing which units these are is going to be handy. And this video is going to be about guessing air units, and all the rest comes later. So I guess that was enough of an introduction, and let's get started. So we start with T1, and basically for all tech levels you have 4 criteria based on which you can distinguish the units. And the first and most obvious one would be speed. And that's actually very notable on the T1 stage. So let's take this group of scouts, for example, and let's compare it with this bomber. You can see that the scouts are about twice as fast as the bomber. So you're going to have a very easy time telling apart scouts from bombers, right? And if you think about it, then this is basically all you need to know about the T1 stage. Because interceptors are usually going to be patrolling as a group, or they're going to be lying on the ground as a group, right? Most people don't spread out their interceptors. In a few high-level games you see people use them for ambushes, and you actually put them in spots where you expect the opponent to send a transport through, in like a first air setup, something like that. But for most purposes, just knowing that interceptors usually stay together, either lying on the ground or patrolling, is going to be enough. So if you disregard all the other stuff that is on the map and you just have this image, then you can already tell that these are interceptors, and these are going to be interceptors too. Just by the context, right? And we already said that speed matters, and you can distinguish the scouts and the bombers by speed, right? So scouts here, bomber here. And that's around twice as fast as the bomber, after the bomber like had to pick up some speed first, right? So the acceleration is also a factor, but just going for the speed consideration is the easiest, right? So you can now distinguish bombers and scouts, and you can distinguish interceptors based on their behavior, right? So behavior and speed, right? And what else is there on the T1 stage? Well, there are gestures, we're going to talk about these later, and there are transports, right? So let's take some transports and fly them over here, switch to the opponent's view, and you can tell by the shape of these units that these are transports. So this is the Aeon transport because they are aligned in a triangle or like a hexagon or something like that. And the Seraphim transport has all units on the same side. The Seraphim transport loaded with T2 units is basically the same thing, except the units are further apart. And this is a UEF or a Cybran transport, since you have 6 units in there plus the transport icon in the center. So that's pretty easy to distinguish, right? Just by the shape. And that's already all for the T1 stage, right? So when you see something that looks like it could be a transport in a team game because of the shape, it looks like the radar blips are sticking together in a fixed pattern, then you want to ping it, because if that lands, it's going to be trouble for your team. And just ping a little too much, that's better than not pinging at all, right? This way you can make sure the ally will react if they have air. And I guess it's worth noting that scouts can come as single scouts. You usually use single scouts if you only want to see the outer layer of the base, or if you want to, or if you're sure that the opponent won't have anti-air. But if there's anti-air, or you're particularly interested in the core of the base and it's a long way, then you send multiple scouts. So scouts don't have to come as single scouts, they don't have to come as groups, both is possible, right? And that's your T1, I'm guessing. Oh, pardon. Now we can actually already move on to T2. And on the T2 stage, you're going to have, well, Swift Winds and T2 bombers. These are the T2 fighter units, right? So fighter bombers are actually just bombers for any faction. I said this before and it doesn't really fit here, I'm digressing, but I want to repeat it for those who haven't seen the other videos. You cannot really use fighter bombers as fighters because they're not going to perform well. You're paying for the HP and you're paying for the bomber capability, but the air-to-air weapon is usually quite bad. And no matter which faction you're using, the fighter bombers won't be able to compete in air fights against T1 interceptors, mass for mass. And Cybran is especially bad in air-to-air combat. Seraphim and UEF are okay, right? If you're outnumbering your opponent, you can consider sending them in and stuff, but Cybran should pretty much never use the air-to-air capability. But that's another topic. You can distinguish Swift Winds by speed of behavior from other air units. So Swift Wind is the fastest T2 unit, and it's basically as fast as a T1 scout, almost, right? And Swift Winds usually come in small groups, because large groups of Swift Winds are quite expensive, and if you can afford these, you usually already can afford ASFs, or at least you can afford ASFs soon, so you don't build a ton of Swift Winds unless it's a critical stage in a high-level 1v1 game, but let's not assume so. So if you have a fast-moving group of units in the T2 stage, and you know that your opponent is Aeon, and you know it can't be scouts, then it is going to be Swift Winds. And these fighter bombers, they are a bit faster than gunships. They are also faster than T1 bombers, and they are slower than Swift Winds. But it's not so notable that the speed is going to help you a lot. So you should take a look at the context. When the opponent is a Cybran, and there is a T2 air HQ, and there are engineers assisting it, after you scouted 2 minutes ago or something, you can pretty much tell that he's going for Corsairs, right? That's usually how it works in team games. They're a very strong weapon, and you can anticipate these by the context, the timing, and of course how they behave. So if you have a group of T1 interceptors, and you can tell by the behavior, like they're circling around your ACU maybe, that they're interceptors, and there's another group of units coming that has almost the same speed of the interceptors, then it's most likely going to be fighter bombers, and you should be dodging with your ACU. So these are probably a bit harder to distinguish from other units, but it's still doable with some experience. Now, torpedo bombers is something you can identify simply by the behavior, because torpedo bombers can only be used in water areas, and if there is something that is not behaving like a Swift Wind and it's on a water area, then it's going to be a torpedo bomber, right? Torpedo bombers are relatively fast. They're quite fast, actually. They're kind of like a T2 scout in terms of speed and stuff, right? But you shouldn't use them as that, of course. Then we have Mercies. And Mercies are usually super obvious, because Mercies don't have HP, so the opponent is going to use them from an angle where he doesn't see any anti-air. So when you see a group, like a small group, or like a group of up to 10 units maybe, that is closing in on your ACU, and it's trying to avoid anti-air, then you should be moving your anti-air around and your ACU to the back, right? And try to intercept with the anti-air. And if you have a ton of T1 fighters and Swift Winds, that is flying over your anti-air and trying to distract it, and there's something else coming in, then you can already aim your anti-air at this something else, because this something else is going to be mercies. And the units are trying to, like the air-to-air combat units are trying to distract your anti-air, so that the turret is rotated to an angle where it first has to change its orientation again before it can shoot at the mercies. And sometimes this narrow time frame where the anti-air turret has to switch targets is enough for the mercies to deliver lethal damage. So make sure to always manually micro your anti-air against mercies. Now, T2 transports are pretty obvious. Of course, you can also put T2 units in them, and in that case, the radar image is going to be more spread out. But this is a very characteristic shape of Aeon T2 transports. And you may wonder, are these combat unit drops? Maybe engineer drops, right? Or are these ghetto gunships? And you can tell by the behavior. So a ghetto gunship is usually going to try to avoid T2 flak and flying in from a very direct angle to the target it's going to snipe. That can be power generator or your ACU usually. And a drop is also avoiding T2 flak, of course, but it is usually going to take the long way around your base, because a drop usually tries to stay hidden, whereas the ghetto gunship tries to get in and deal damage as fast as possible. So timing is not as important for drops, it's rather the avoiding of any air units, but timing is crucial for ghettos, and that's why you can't waste time when you use ghettos and like fly the far way around the enemy base. And that's how you can distinguish ghettos from other T2 transports loaded with units. And you have to watch out for the ACU drop, because ACU drops are a very commonly used strategy actually, and they are also very strong, even after the ACU build power nerf in the last patch. And you just have to burn this image into your eye and into your memory, because if you have this fixed distance of these two dots, that is going to be like an Aeon com drop, and for other factions these two dots are going to be closer together, but you get the idea. Like, if there are two attached radar blips moving quickly, then it's going to be a com drop. And usually there's going to be a cloud of interceptor around these, and shooting this down is going to be super important. And if you cannot shoot it down in time, then build many T1 land factories and switch them into T1 RD immediately, and put the rally point to the spot where you expect the com drop to land. And that's how you can try to counter it. So I explained that T2 gunships are relatively difficult to identify. That's because their speed is like so mediocre that they could be anything pretty much. But that is not too much of an issue usually, because T2 gunships deal damage over time and not a lot of alpha damage in a short interval. And that's why you can basically afford not identifying them right away, and rather tell by like how they are hovering over your units and how they're already targeting units, even though they may not be at the target of choice already, right? So maybe there are 10 T2 gunships trying to kill your ACU, and on the way they're already going to shoot at something that's in front of the ACU, and that's how you identify them, right? But usually T2 gunships are not an ideal snipe weapon, and since they take so long to kill stuff, it has to be a lot of them for the snipe to actually work out. So I wouldn't be too afraid of these, right? Now that's basically all for T2 units. I guess a special case is the beetle drop. And some people don't use deceivers in their transports when they drop beetles, because that's taking up transport space. So if you put a deceiver in transport, then it's going to be hidden from the radar, and if you're on the receiving end, you basically don't have any way of identifying it without setting up a scout perimeter. So you should just try to be lucky, I guess. But if the transports are, well, not stealthed, then you can identify a beetle drop by its behavior, like how it's closing in on your ACU. Because usually T2 units are like things you want to drop far away from a commander, because the commander overcharge is going to kill them. And if it still goes next to the ACU, then it must be a high alpha strike damage weapon, right? And that can only be beetles. So very straightforward, actually. You can tell by the context. Now let's get rid of these T2 units. I guess one more word about the Jester. This is a special case, but generally if the opponent is using a weapon that cannot be an interceptor or a scout because of its behavior and speed in the T1 stage, and the opponent is Cybran, then the timing will decide whether it's a bomber or a Jester. So usually if it comes late it's a Jester, and if it comes early it's a bomber. There are some exceptions if people go first air Jester first, for example, but usually that doesn't matter too much, because the only difference is that you can dodge bombers but you cannot dodge Jesters. And other than that, the strong T1 mobile anti-air is going to take care of like a Jester or a bomber. It won't really make a difference. So the times where a Jester would feed on T1 mobile anti-air for veterancy, these times are over since the last patches. Now we did forget the kennel, the UEF engineering station thing, and there's the drone, right? There are also ACU drones and support ACU drones, by the way, and these are units you can usually identify by their behavior. So if you give like a construction order and you send the drone to assist it, then it's going to hover around the unit that it's trying to build, right? And you can tell by the speed, the flying altitude, and how it's circling like a satellite on very low altitude, that is going to be a drone, right? And that's quite easy to identify too. Now we can actually move on to T3 units, and T3 units are, well, the most obvious is going to be the ASF, and these are super fast units, not as fast as T3 scouts, but still fast. And you can tell that they are ASFs by, well, their speed, their very characteristic like a turn rate, the way how they, you know, are rotating around their own angle, how they are being microed and bunched up close together. And of course you can tell by the context. If the game is in the late stage, like 10 minutes or later, then depending on the map, this may be T3 air stage already. And then you're pretty much certain that these are ASFs. And what you sometimes see is a strat rush, and then you usually have a player standing in ASFs first, then there is one unit that is like kind of behind the ASFs, so that the ASFs can intervene and kill anything that's trying to kill the strat. Or you have situations where the opponent sends in all ASFs first and then sends the strats, which is actually smarter. But either way, if there is like a lone unit that isn't behaving like the rest, and it's early T3 stage, especially when your air player doesn't have air, then you can pretty much tell it's going to be a strat. And that's like the lone strat rush thing that is killing your T2 power generators or your mixes, stuff like that, right? Or your like T2 factories maybe. And if you have multiple strats, well, that's usually going to be a bit later. If the opponent had air control but didn't use it, it may be because they are saving up strats for a snipe. And you can tell these are strats because they fly in, well, a characteristic speed at a characteristic timing in terms of game time. And they're usually very close together and very obviously locked on the same target as they're like bombing it, right? So strats are quite easy to identify, I'd say. Now Solaces are like T2 torpedo bombers. They're faster and even faster than strats actually, but not as fast as ASFs. And these are also units you can like identify by their behavior, since they're going to be used around water, right? So that's pretty straightforward. And there are T3 gunships. These are, well, the Siren one is going to be identified by the jamming. So I hope the jamming is on, and yeah, there we go. So this is all one unit, and you can see that the blips are connected in some geometric pattern, and this is because of the radar jamming, right? So if this flies around, you can tell pretty easily that this is going to be a T3 gunship. And you always have 5 blips per gunship, I guess, right? So that's not a lot of air units, that's just a single T3 gunship. And if you know that the opponent is Cybran, then it's going to be a piece of cake to identify that one. And other than that, well, T3 gunships have the shape of a T1 bomber, but they have a different accelerating behavior. Like, they can basically turn 360 without having to like hover and fly small curves and shit like that. They just change the orientation of their whatever you call that, jetpack, I don't know. And that's how it works, right? So these come in small groups or sometimes in medium-sized groups. And usually T3 gunships are part of Rassel's air build, which is the build that is trying to exploit the narrow time frame between you having ARAS and an actual like ASF production lead, and like the like basically when you have ASFs, it's going to be too late to make use of Rassel's air build. So this build is exploiting the time frame before you have ASFs, but it also requires you to have relatively little T1 and T2 interceptors. And if you know your weakness and you know that you don't have a lot of T1 and T2 interceptors, and the opponent is obviously not going for RAS, then it's going to be Rassel's air build into T3 UEF or Cybran gunships. And that's how you can identify them pretty easily by context. And of course the speed and how close they travel together when they are in a group is also a characteristic. And the Restore, well, the Restore is kind of a strange unit. It becomes somewhat usable when you have large numbers, but on small numbers it's not that great, because it's basically a tanky but weak air-to-air weapon and a tanky but weak air-to-ground weapon at the same time. And you really just use them if you actually need both in a single unit combined. And it's really not a unit that is used too much since all the nerfs. So yeah, whatever. But you can identify this by the speed. It's actually even slower than the T3 gunship of other factions. So Cybran UEF T3 gunships are going to be faster than the Restore. And when you have a group of units traveling at a very slow speed, but not in a locked pattern because it's like a transport or whatever, transport's also faster. But what am I saying? You can see very easily that the Restore is even slower than the Cybran gunship, and that's how you can tell them apart. So T3 stage slow stuff must be Restore. Okay, so we had these. And this. And well, stuff that is like moving in quickly to your position is going to be a T3 scout. And sometimes people try to off-map their scouts so you don't see them coming in. And if they have, like if you have T3 anti-air, then it's not going to be able to lock at the scout properly if it's off-mapping, like flying around here, for example. And scouts are usually nasty and you want to like avoid getting scouted most of the time. But you cannot do too much about them usually, and they're not harming you directly, right? And I guess it's time to take a look at experimental units. So basically all air experimentals except the Seraphim bomber are very slow. This is basically has the speed of a grandma in a wheelchair, but it's also very tanky. And if you see a group of ASFs traveling and there's like one isolated unit traveling at a very slow speed, and you may have identified the build pattern of like having many engineers on the opponent's base around like nothing. That's like an experimental construction site, and that's going to be the Soul Ripper if it's starting to fly suddenly, right? So quite easy to identify. And if the opponent is Aeon, it's going to be a SAR. Some people also use their SAR to build units, and sometimes they unload the units, and it looks like that. They're coming out of like the exits on the sides, and it's relatively easy to tell that this is a SAR if people do that. But other than that, just by how slow it is and that it's around your ASFs but not directly in the group and obviously like isolated, it's going to tell you that it's an experimental. And what some beginners do is they give an assist order to the SAR, and then the ASFs are going to like go around the SAR in this like very characteristic pattern, right? And that's also how you can identify that they're guarding something, which must be an air experimental. And the satellite, also called the Force Scout, is something you don't usually have to identify because it doesn't do a lot, even after it was buffed. But you can tell by the opponent building something for a very long time, and when it's finished, something comes out of there. So with some map awareness, even if you don't have the scout, in that exact moment you can tell that it's going to be a satellite, right? And the Seraphim Bomber, that's the one that is flying quite fast. So that's faster than Strat Bombers actually. And unless it hovers, it's going to travel at a constant high speed. Also usually a little bit isolated from your ASFs, so you can tell that this is something fishy, right? Not too difficult. So let's take a look at this from the blind perspective again. So you can see this is isolated, this is relatively fast, faster than the Strat, must be a Seraphim Bomber, right? So you can see this is actually very easy, and with some experience you can distinguish all air units in the game simply by taking an educated guess and considering these 4 factors: speed, the shape for transport especially, but also for interceptors, the behavior, whether they are locked on a target or whether they are like flying around a target, then they're air-to-air units instead of air-to-ground units. And well, game time and context of course matters, right? An exposed ACU is going to be snipe. If you have that and something is closing in, it must be a snipe, usually, right? So I hope this helped, and I'm going to provide more tutorials that tell you how to identify units based on radar blips in the next couple of days. We're going to take a look at land units, we're going to take a look at whether commanders are coming in or raid is coming in, and we're going to take a look at bases and maybe even more. Not sure yet. So I hope people found this informational and entertaining, and see you for the next tutorial.